So good evening, Mr. Riley.
Good evening.
I should come back to seeing Cordell. We've known each other now since at least 1975, 76, or thereabouts.
Thereabouts, yeah.
When we first went to Work Academy.
That is correct.
That's the time when we met. Those days of Zaki Marshall.
Yes, what an adventure those days were.
And that's an understatement. So, welcome back. We want to thank you again to our listening audience. As you know, we now have these weekly or bi-weekly sessions, which are going to be termed virtual conversations. And the idea is to bring to light things that persons have asked about, or things that I want to bring to the community that are of interest, to make sure that we can inform, we can have them invite them to ask any questions, they provide information. Because of course, one thing that I did as part of the election is I instituted a plan whereby I will be in regular contact. And I'm reminded about that on a regular basis now, that this, Anthony, what about? And so I want to make sure that I'm always able to reach out. And there are so many people right now in the community who have interest, information, they're busy, and this will provide an avenue for them to share any information or comments to the broader public. You, Cordell, Mr. Riley, I have termed before intentionally as being one of the most objective and informed commentators, social commentators, in a variety of ways. And of course, I know you from before in terms of, not before, but
when I was famous.
But when you, I was going to say when you transitioned, obviously you went to academy, then you went overseas and did a degree in hotel administration, hospitality maybe, and then over time, in my mind, transitioned to be a statistician, and then more recently, well not recently, but the medium distance, I guess, became very active in hurling, working at some point with the late Bolton Brown. And now, when I need good research information, I'll reach out to you, and you always provide factual information. And so last time you came on, you talked about some comments around the election, and then you did inform us that you had not, based upon the time, you had not had a chance yet to actually look at the results of the 2020 election and see what that meant. My comments before had been from my canvassing that we now know that under normal circumstances, the black middle class would be the swing voter. This time around, while they may have also been the swing voter, we know for sure there are many of voters, white voters, that were either swing voters, like they switched from the OBA to the PLP, or some in fact stayed home. And so we can talk about that as we go through tonight.
Sure.
So that would really go. And even when I prepared for tonight, one of my comments was that I was interested that the OBA had actually announced their leader, but at first they said that they will go through a process and it will be formalized at their annual convention. But having said that, it's almost as if the appointment is to some degree anticlimactic in the sense that they had a huge loss. There was some speculation or comments in terms of the Honorable Craig Kennedy, under normal circumstances, when a party has such a significant loss or a negative result, that the leader would resign. His point was that he wasn't going to resign, but allow the party machinery to take its due course at the election, at their annual meeting. And then if they wanted to go, he would go, which is very different, by the way, in terms of me saying, well, here is my resignation. If you refuse it, that's very different than saying, well, we don't want you anymore. And so now we have the Honorable Cole Simons as the leader, and they will announce their cabinet. So do you have any comments about that before we start? And then let's go into the actual election results.
Well, only in the sense that he ran unopposed apparently, and therefore it was a fait accompli. So that's how it kind of got out, because there was only one candidate. So when you have that sort of thing, it's hard to keep that under wraps, and so that gets out to the public. So there has been some talk about there hasn't been a formal announcement, and there hasn't as far as I'm concerned, but that kind of information you really couldn't keep under wraps.
Okay, gotcha. And do you have any, before we start, any general comments about what you foresee as the future of the OBA or the FDM for that matter, given that the FDM was also a new entity when it came to this election?
Well, the interesting thing, going back to one of your earlier comments about the turnout, one of the things I've noticed having looked at the data is right there in plain sight, is the fact that the OBA vote was down significantly by about 40%, where the PLP's vote turnout was down by about 20%. But more so for the OBA, the reason for that, a large portion of that was that in 5 constituencies, they had no candidates. So if you're an OBA supporter and you didn't have a candidate, what would be the point of you going to the polls? So whilst it looked like a whole lot of them didn't turn out, well, there's a reason. Then you have to look at that portion, how much of that was the overall dissatisfaction with the leadership, and therefore that portion would have stayed home. And then there would have been probably a smaller portion who may have decided that they'll vote for PLP. So it's hard to get at all of those things, but the overriding factor was that in 5 constituencies, there were no OBA candidates.
And so going back to your professional background as a statistician, how do you, or would somebody at some point try to factor out those 5 constituencies, because it's to ensure that we are comparing apples with apples?
Right. So you can do it taking out those 5 constituencies, but still the unknown was how those voters were feeling. Would they have actually showed up to the polls if there was a candidate? From a statistical point of view, you would have to make some assumptions about their behavior. And the way you can normally do that is you take a small sample of those who didn't come out and you find out the reasons, and then you extrapolate that to the whole. And you say, well, based on those who didn't show up, here's what they're saying, so this is likely what happened. In the absence of that, you would just make some sort of statements that there was a portion, and you don't know what proportion of those would have come out, what proportion of them were upset. So it's pure speculation if you don't have anything to go on.
And so, again, yourself and others, do you think someone would, or do you tend actually to do the rest of the analysis so that we can have a more accurate description, I guess, of the results? Because, again, as you talk always and learn different things, and I'm interested to understand that rather than give a blanket comment that says that the PLP did or did not, and the OBA did or did not, and FDM did not, to do what you're saying, which is to maybe do a real poll, if you will, of those 5 constituencies, and try to get to a better understanding of the reason for them not acting, if that's the way to put it.
Well, I tried to do an annual poll. This time around, we got caught up with the election. So what I possibly could do is when we ask the normal range of questions, we can add some that says, did you vote in the last election? If you didn't vote, why not? And maybe have a box in terms of the constituency they were registered in. And that way you can kind of not only find out from those who didn't vote in those 5 constituencies, but also in the other constituencies as well. And then you can better extrapolate that data for the entire population. So that's something that could be done. Now, obviously, you're going to lengthen the questionnaire and you sort of just want to get in and get out. But that's how I would tackle it.
And going back to the interview last time, where you didn't have as much time, are you able to concisely explain this?
Sorry? What the idea behind polling?
Yeah, there's always the concern in terms of why the number, 400 for example, or 600, because I think the general public now needs to, they always want to know, and very often what happens is they question whether or not 400 is the right number.
Right.
Or whatever number you use, but generally I think.
It's 400. And in fact, it's not actually the number, it is the margin of error. So the margin of error is if you were to take the whole population, and since we can't do that, so the sample we take, how wrong are we, if I can put it that way, is our sample based on the entire population. The higher, the more you survey, the more likely your results reflect the population. So if you do a survey of around 400, that gives you a margin of error of 4.5%. What that means is that, so for instance, if I have a poll that says the PLP is at 40% and the OBA is at 30%, that means that the OBA or PLP's figure is somewhere plus or minus that 4%. 4%. So let's use 5% for argument. So the margin of error is 5%, and Michael says that the OBA has 30%. That actually means their true followers could be as low as 25 or as high as 35. Now, if the PLPs were at 40%, that could mean that their true support is at 35 or as high as 45. But you'll notice there that the high end for the OBA is 35, and the low end for the PLP would be 35. So that means it will be statistically the same. So it's not, so we would use the term, it's not statistically significant. But if the PLP were at 45, then they will be statistically ahead. So the more people you do, if we do 1,000 people, then the margin of error will be plus or minus 3%, right?
Yeah, and just ask again, because you could now that say 400, for example, would be a 5% error, and 1,000 would be a 3% error. How do you calculate those percentages? Like, is that just a standard? Or?
That's a standard. So there's a statistical formula, and so the more you do, so at 1,000, it's plus. At the 95% level, it means you're 95% confident that your results are within the margin of error. So if the reason we don't do 1,000 is because it's costly, right? So some people say, well, you only did 400, why don't we do more? So if I go and do a survey, and I do my 400, that's because the client, you tell the client, this is how much it's going to cost. And they say, well, okay, well, no, we want more results. And we tell you, well, then it is going to be more. Because the margin of error, and I should say this, has an inverse relationship to the sample size. So in order to halve the sample, the margin of error, sample size has an inverse relationship to the margin of error. So in order to halve the margin of error, I have to double my sample size, right? And so we tell them that, they say, wait a minute, because now you're doubling your cost almost thereabouts. And so most would say no. So I've seen surveys for in the United States as low as 600, right? But most of them are around about 1,000. In fact, most Western countries do about 1,000, so long as the survey allows those who have an opportunity to be in the sample, That is where it's becoming increasingly difficult because of the technology now. People have cell phones, they don't have a registered number at home. So if I use the phone book, then I'm only going to get those at home, right? Those who have a home phone number. But in order for me to get young people, then I do a portion of the survey online. If we had a database of young people, the cell numbers would be easier. And then those who change their cell numbers. So I tend to be in the field a whole lot longer if I'm doing it just for public consumption than other companies, because I'm trying to get more young people, because I want my surveys to be representative of the population. But if I'm being paid by a client, the client says we need the results by, if I say I can get in and out in 3 weeks, I have to take what I've got. I can weight the data. There are statistical techniques that allow you to weight the data to make it look like the population, but I still need to have a representative number of, say, young people. I can always get the over 55 crowd. It's more difficult to get the 40s, but we can get those. But when you get under 40, that is a real challenge, and your sample will not necessarily reflect the population. So that's what I'm most careful of. When I present my results, that it is represented. I know I've done all I could to get those younger people involved.
And then one last question about the margin of error. Bermuda has a population, let's say, of 60,000, and so the 400 gives you an error, margin of error of 5%. Is that the same for, like, if you have 1 million people, or at what level does that actually change? Just want to be very careful that we explain to the general public now how that actually works. What's the limits?
So the larger the population, there is a correction factor, but it doesn't take that much off. And it's not necessarily related to the overall population. So we did 1,000 in Bermuda. It's plus or minus 3%, as well as in the United States. So it's not really affected by the size of the population. Once you have a very large sample or very large population, it does. In fact, if I have a small population, so if I was doing, say, 300, there may be a correction I would use that says I don't have to do 300, but if I only have 300, I might as well do them all.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's not directly related to the population. So the thing that you have to be concerned about is whether the sample is representative of the entire population.
Meaning random selection.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha. And that's good. And I think for those in the general public who always comment that pills are taken, that it's been very good for me, it's been very useful. And what we aim to do is periodically probably ask the same question and even do a different type of video clip that shows it.
Okay.
That's what we're working on doing now.
Well, maybe I have to revise that class I once taught called Data-Driven Decisions, where I explain polling as a part of it.
Okay, but that would be good. I had to ask the mic for a minute, that's why I did what I did. So looking forward to that, Ken.
Okay.
Certainly, as I said earlier, we're trying to make sure that we provide information that is useful to everyone and things that are being asked in the broader community. So, but let's turn back to the election results. So based upon what you've done, do you have any comments about the white voters in terms of behavior this time around, or is it still just anecdotal as opposed to based upon any actual analysis of the results?
Right, yeah, it's unless you get a hold of the registers and see the portion who actually voted, it's very difficult to say. Like I said, we know that, for instance, from the OBA perspective, they didn't have 5 persons in their constituency. So that would have meant, and because of the voter base is larger of the white population, or historically has been, then you know there would have been quite a number of whites who did not come out to vote. I know from the previous election, when we were doing polling, the airport was of a major concern, and there had been some who had mentioned that they were going to switch because of the airport. That's why in my view, the airport was the dividing factor. I think I shared the anecdote with you the last time about the individual we pulled, and when we came to the question, this is a white male, and when we came to the question, who are you going to vote for in the upcoming election? And they said, I'll tell you, my story. They said, all along, I voted for either the UBP or the OBA. But in this election, the 2017 election, I'm going to be voting for the PRP. And before my poster would say, well, why do that? He said, I'll tell you why. He said, it's because of the airport. He felt that the worst thing that they did during their time was to give the airport away to a foreign entity for 30 years or longer. It's going to be. And he was so upset with it that he was going to change his vote. And in that constituency, it did change from OBA to PLP. So that's anecdotal, but how many more felt that way, I'm not sure. So we know from things like that, when they volunteer the information, we wonder how many else felt that same way. In this election, I didn't do as many polls that I did the last time, so I didn't get a lot of the feedback. But I would imagine that there was concern, I think primarily, and this is all anecdotal, about the leadership of the OBA and where that was going. And but the challenge was, though, there were very few who were able to take on the mantle. We have, of course, Simon taking it on now, and it'll be interesting to see in what direction he takes it. But that was the concern among some white voters. But in terms of what else was at play, I would definitely have to look at the figures and see if I can extrapolate something from that.
Again, we're looking forward to any comments you have around that. And today we're going to date ourselves, but today is the eve of the US election.
Yes.
And so, again, just to touch on it briefly, because I want to make sure that we fully discuss the whole idea of polling levels tonight also, is what are your comments about that? Because very often what happens is the election will be tomorrow night, the polls close, and they almost give instant comments in terms of who has won from that state. And I now quite understand how they can do that with apparently such accuracy.
Well, they do exit polls. And so in the United States, when you're giving the polls, they sample you. or they may even have a body of voters that they can call a meeting, they say, have you voted, and get a sample. So they do exit polls. That's something that's not traditionally done here. You don't have people leave the polls, and I don't think too many Bermudians would say, tell people when they're leaving the polls who they voted for. But in the United States, there's that tradition where people willingly, because they register as Democrats or they register as Republicans. So that's a whole different thing in the United States, where you might be members of the PLP, you might be members of the OBA, but that's not public knowledge. Whereas in overseas, you can register. So they look and say, well, they're registered as a Democrat. You heard President Trump say, well, Fauci is a Democrat anyway, right? So that's, you register as one or the other. And again, so you don't want people to know you register as an independent or you don't register at all. But that's how they know. So they do these exit polls, and based on those exit polls, sometimes they are wrong. But yes, if they get a representative sample, they can be fairly reflected, and if people are telling you the truth, and because the states are so much larger, a few people here, a few people there, not telling the truth doesn't affect the overall sample, because most people are going to tell you who they voted for.
And just now you mentioned the idea of the airport still being, or what was at some stage, a major component in people's minds when it came to the election, how they would vote. The airport is now announced as going to be opening effective up to December 9th for regular commercial traffic. What comments do you have on that in terms of the impact on us as a people, given the significance of it all?
Well, I mean, going back to this whole scenario of the need for an airport, I think with regards to the OBA, the messaging was quite off, in the sense that at the time they're trying to sell the public the need for the airport, when that wasn't the sales pitch that needed to be made, because I think everybody who had been there could see that there are some areas that needed to improve, and even in the back house, what we didn't see, we certainly had enough footage that repairs needed to be done, or a new airport. That was never in question. What was in question was how that airport was going to be built and where the money was going to come from. And I think that's why I keep going back to the fact that there's a salient issue in the election, because just before the election, you had this $5 million that had to be paid, and then just before the election, it was another 15.7 or whatever it was. So you got this $20 million there, and all the things that were said before about the fact that this airport is going to cost the people of Bermuda, the taxpayers, a lot of money, has now come back to haunt us, so to speak. So that's why, when you come up with these figures, that this is what they've asked for, and on top of that, you're going to pay for electricity and other expenditures and all of that, and the public is saying, well, where is this money coming from? Where is all this money coming from? Well, the government had to borrow the money. It's as simple as that. And so that's why the people's fear is about the airport and how it was constructed. That is what's coming home to roost. And so when I was interviewed about 2 weeks before the election, I basically said all the PLP had to do is to remind the voting public how much is the report is costing people. And that's how I felt. Now, others would have a different interpretation, but my view was that was a salient issue, and that hasn't gone away.
And before we transition from the voting discussions, what would you say as a comment to encourage young people to vote? Because I know during my canvassing, there were older persons tended to have their minds set they're going to vote. Having said that, by the way, there were some persons, about one lady in particular, who was, I believe, about 67 years old and had never voted.
Yeah.
And so she registered. I was very pleased to know that she did actually come out and vote. And one of the positives, I guess, there are many, but one positive for sure about canvassing is you get to see these things live, and then I talk to you, for example, I hear your comments or your concerns, and especially if you are not necessarily going to vote, and then we talk, have a conversation, and I see you active vote, that's very, very, very refreshing, of course, just to happen, because it means that the conversations, however brief they may be, do act as an encouragement to others to come. So what would your comments be about the need, the value or why people should vote, even given that we just finished the election. And I also asked on the second question, by the way, because many comments came about the fact that people believe there needs to be a strong opposition. And so trying to answer those two things, please.
Okay, so tackling the first one, you sort of broke it down to young people versus people overall voting. I think people will vote if they feel that by voting, it affects change. And if you don't necessarily see the changes that you want, people can become disheartened. Young people in particular don't necessarily see the world as we do. There are other things that they want rather be involved in. Politics is not necessarily one of them. I have almost all adults now, my children, and we kind of sort of have to marshal them out to the polls, right? Gotta get there, you gotta get there. What you mean you're not gonna be? Well, okay, yeah, you gotta go and vote. So they just don't see this as something that's necessary for them, and if they don't participate, they don't see it as necessary for them. You could go down the road in terms of how we got the right to vote and all of those things, but they might see that as distant. So sometimes when I'm with my own children, I might, particularly the younger one now, the others are older, but I might say things to them about, how do people get wealthy in this country? And I'll talk about slavery, and I'll talk about how the slave owners got wealth, and how that wealth was not taxed, and what happens if they die, and who does that money go to? And they'll say, well, it goes to the children, and I say, what do you think? And so there's that link between what happened in the past to the present, and then once they have that history, then you can start talking about, and this is why you need to go out and vote. So you sort of have to be doing the education, but you have to sort of just drop it. In my case, anyway, it just in little bits.
Yes.
When you have that time. Normally, when I used to take them to ballet, that was the time to sort of drop these little nuggets in them while we're driving around down there, and just so they have the understanding, and so that you don't have to do this hard sort of slog when they get older. You basically have done your job, and they should understand why there's a need to vote. Now, the same applies to adults. If they understand there's a need, if they understand their vote makes a difference, there's a change, that you can actually hold the government accountable, then it's worth voting.
Okay. And actually, that's a good segue in terms of some history, because as I say to you very often, you're a very busy person, you do so many things. And the most recent one I saw you doing, which was the one, I think I saw it, must be Monday or Tuesday of this week, in terms of you were doing a presentation to, I believe the correct name is the Land Grab Commission.
Well, I think it's the Commission on Inquiry into Historic Land Losses. That's its official name.
The unofficial one, the Land Grab.
The Land Grab is the unofficial one.
It's certainly easier to remember. So talk about that, because some of the comments you were making were very interesting, and it's timely because obviously I am the candidate, not candidate, representative for C7 in Hamilton South, which encompasses that entire area. And just give some feedback if you can. Or is it acceptable to talk briefly about your presentation?
Sure, it's public, yeah.
Okay, good. So give us some comments. I saw it online, but obviously not everyone has had the chance to do so. So give us some feedback about that, please.
Okay, so we got involved because we were the ones that took the issue to the ombudsman some years ago with regards to the graves and how they were not being upkept. And so the ombudsman then had their own inquiry and came up with a report, and the report was called a grave error because the graves had been demolished. And so we got involved in that. The Tuckerstown Historical Society is the main drivers, and Marsden Methodist Church are the trustees for the grave. Although it came up on the commission, the question came up, who actually owned the graves? It was assumed that the trustees own the graves, but that may not necessarily be so. That may be something that the commission will find out who actually owns it, because if Tuckerstown owns the land, do they actually own the graves? and the Marston Church is just responsible for making sure that the Tucker's Point, whoever's responsible, maintains the grave. But who actually owns it? So that was a question that came up, and I don't think it was resolved that day that I was there. So we have been very much concerned about that because we've seen this type of thing happen in numerous other countries where people of color, First Americans, you name it, Polynesians, where they've had their land bulldozed, or the graveyard bulldozed to go to the parking lot, to go to the mall. And there's so many cases of this happening. Whereas if it were a white grave, and we brought up the reference of the naval graveyard and dockyard, where that is pristine, the grass is mowed all the time. Just can you imagine somebody going up there and bulldozing that and say we're going to put a driving range there for people to practice golf when they come off the ship? It will be a hue and cry. But that is exactly what happened down there in Tucker's Point. That was land that was owned largely by blacks. They were forced out of their land by a special development order.
Yes.
There is question as to whether or not they were paid a fair price for their land. The question that was put to me, did I think it was based on the rule of law because it had a special development order and the government paid them that?
Yeah.
I said, well, you can put it that way, but if the members of parliament were also partners with Furnace Whitney, the company that was developing it, and passing laws, and the laws are going to benefit them, that is not the rule of law, that's corruption. And so it's a different law game. And so if that was corruption, then there's got to be some sort of penalty paid for the corruption that took place. Because if I pass a law, if you're sitting in Parliament now and you pass a law, that law is supposed to benefit the entire Bermuda.
Yes.
Right? But if you pass a law that nets you money and billions and all of that, then that will be seen as corruption because it's exactly what it would be. So these are the things that the commission have to take under advisory. How are they going to deal with that situation? Because the records are there. We know who the parliamentarians were. We have the stories, and this whole commission is piecing together those loosely knit stories to come up with a composite whole.
And if you can assist us, what would you foresee or what would you intend to be a reasonable outcome for the commission in terms of if, as you said, we know who participated, so the family lines who participated, who were parliamentarians at the time, and can be quite seen. There's always going to be comments in terms of, yes, there's a special development order, if I did pay you, but almost to be honest, by definition, it could not have been a fair price because the fact that I'm forced you to sell means that there wasn't an equal or an open conversation about the exchange of the land and whatever. So, but what do you foresee or what do you think Kerm's position would be in terms of an effective resolution?
Well, we made a number of recommendations, but they were all along the lines of low-hanging fruit, like a study to find out what actually went wrong, how did the graves get demolished, all of those things. And we were asked, how would that be paid for? I said, well, that'd be amount to a few $100,000. You could take a portion of the tax from those lands and finance that. So that wouldn't require government to raise any additional funding, but it would help them to get to some of the answers. The bigger issue is the corruption issue, or what I labeled as corruption. And if that is found to be true, then how do you redress that? Now, as we have made, meaning we, have looked into the Reparations Commission in the West Indies, and what they're looking at, well, we did get to reach them, but Chris Famous did have them on a radio program, and we were able to get questions in. And one of the questions was, how do you become a part of it? Yeah. And their response was that you start a chapter in Bermuda, and you start gathering information, and you start lobbying, as it were, say, to get Bermuda as part of the Reparations Commission, and they're looking at something so more of a broader level. They're not looking at giving Cordell Roddy $100,000
Right.
because that's what we determined that his family should have gotten. It's more as if you owe money, it goes into a fund, and you have people that manage that fund too. And so you look at things like education, you look at things like entrepreneurship. You find ways to make sure that the money is being spent for the purpose for which it's given. Now that's on a broader level where you don't have you don't have the people there, as it were. So it's a historical injustice, and so you're remedying an historical injustice. But in the Tucker's Town situation, it is a historical injustice, but it's not that far gone. And, you're talking about the 1920s. Some of the people maybe still around. I mean, they're up in their age, and they'll be going off the scene fairly soon. But their descendants there, and they would have passed all those stories to their descendants, like the Denny Richardsons, like the Eugene Stubbs, like the Keith Dubois, all of them, and other persons who were relatives who were there. They would have passed on those stories, so they can look at it from that kind of perspective, or they can look at it from a more personal perspective. So that's something that's going to have to come out in terms of how, if wrongdoing was in fact found, how would that be redressed? And so that's why Curb decided that we would try to get involved with the Reparations Commission to see what the rationale is, how they're going to go about things, rather than just say, oh, we need to do this. Let's look at a structure and see how that structure is working and how we can replicate that structure in Bermuda.
And it's interesting that you mentioned some of these. It may not be, for example, the individual person, which would be now, I guess, the age of bracket between the 60 and 80 or even older than.
Probably 70 and above, yeah.
Because some of the names you mentioned, actually, they still live in the area. Mr. Bond, a few others, and so it'll be interesting to do and talk to them. That may be something we do in the future, is to have one or two persons come and tell their story, because I think sometimes by doing that, we're able to bridge the gap, and to also, as we do traditionally, is to pass on the oral history. That's very important, because we tend not to, as a people in middle age now, but also as youngsters, I think we don't know our history, therefore we do things that are not practical or positive, to be honest. Which we would not do, sorry, if we understood the history that's in our state not only is. And briefly, you mentioned also that the Martin Church being heavily involved, but you're aware, I'm sure, also of St. Philip's and the physically involved.
Yeah, yes. We mentioned their church down there, and even with a protest when the church was still there, and somebody would have bulldozed it for a home. That protest failed. And so, we've been through several iterations of this. I just want to point out too that when we were preparing before the commission, the QC at the time, he had tried to label us as non-expert witnesses because we didn't have a degree in history and such and such. And then he also tried to rule us out as having not factual information, but having opinions without even hearing what we were presenting, because we had to give an open statement. And he kind of said, well, none of that is, he tried to say to the commission, what they're going to say, I don't see how that's going to have any relevance on the commission's deliberations. But thankfully he was overruled. And none of what we presented was our opinion. We gave the sort of historical context around the land grant, how these things were able to happen. But the thing that one of the questions we were asked after we presented was, had we done any research? So my question was, I interpret it as, have we done any primary research? So primary research is research that you go out and collect yourself, as opposed to desk research where I go to the library, I use somebody's book and see what they found. So, and you just mentioned these oral studies, and my response was that in order to do that would have been very expensive, and we as a charitable organization don't have the kind of funds to go out and do this kind of very expensive research. But the point I did make, which I perhaps should have made, was that nobody there at that hearing would have presented primary research, because no one's gone out and done any research on their own. Then maybe Keith Swan with his researching his book, but he would have researched stuff that was already done.
Right.
No one's done an oral research with the descendants or any of them surviving or their children in order to get those stories and then try to piece it together. No one's done that kind of research. So no one would have done any primary research. So therefore, according to the QC statement, all of it was irrelevant.
I wasn't present for sure, and it's quite alarming, to be honest, to hear that you would have a QC trying to disqualify others from presenting, given that the goal, I would have thought, for the commission would be to find out all relevant information. They then, during the deliberations, can certainly sift out certain things if they choose to do so, but to try to stop the information coming forward, I think is very, very surprising, very concerning, to be honest.
Well, the interesting thing is that we had to submit all our documents prior to the hearing. So we had to submit the documents, give a statement. We had, it was a very formal process. So at some point they could have said, I'm sorry that we don't see the relevance in what you're doing. That didn't come forth. And so on the day, the QC tried to shut us down. And I wasn't surprised because we had a briefing with him about 2 weeks earlier. And I kind of knew the angle he was going to take. So none of it surprised me. And I didn't watch the one for Theo where apparently he went at Theo like Dr. Theodore Francis like a pit bull. And when Dr. McDowell presented, he was very, very tame, and people were pointing that sort of out to me, and I thought, well, that's par for the course. But I was quite prepared that if he came for me, I was going to shove back just as far as he threw it to me. And so when he came, about this fact or something, and I responded that, I gave the opening presentation. I said, this is all fact. None of this is my opinion. So I was quite prepared. And then about 15 minutes through our presentation, he injects again and said he really doesn't see why. The commission actually had to break, deliberated, and then when they came back, we never saw him again. And then the next thing we knew, he had resigned.
That's actually good news, to be honest, because when I say good news, I don't know him personally, I don't mean to be offensive in that sense, but it's interesting that when we try to find out information, that it be unbiased in the research or the research, that it be unbiased and not try, as I said, to shut things down, because then it gives the appearance that we're not being genuine in trying to find out facts and find the information. So again, good that whoever participated, not for that person individually, but they were able to press through to try to allow a person to give these stories, give the information, and then they, as a commission, will come back and hopefully give something more concise or more cohesive, I suppose. And it's up to all of us to take the interest and make sure that we find out. And now, what I'm finding, to be honest, is that there is so much information. The question now is, how do we try to, number one, provide focus for ourselves in what we do? And then once you do that, how do you make sure that you're working with facts as opposed to wholehearted opinion? And I'll speak now in terms of me being a new parliamentarian. Of course, everyone's calling out all kinds of requests, information, and what have you, and you need to make sure that you can choose and find out what's
very busy.
So, well, I'm going to catch you up. But again, it is interesting to find maybe groups that can provide certain levels of expertise. And one small example is that the regulatory authority are now going to engage in information gathering, I suppose, in terms of the factual versus anecdotal impacts of the new 5G. And one of my constituents, for example, talked about that. What was my thought about it during the election time? And I said that really I don't have an opinion because they understand what is the science behind it all before I can give a comment. So now it's going to be interesting for them to hopefully mobilize and be part of the process. Because what I say to people now is, to the extent that you have a concern, get involved, because there's so much stuff that can be done, and therefore you can be beneficial to your community. So again, thank you for that. We look forward to the commission's results, and for you, can actually do many different things because you're already busy, but to come back at some other point in time or recommend you think can come and speak pretty definitively about the whole movement around that and what's going to come of it. And hopefully for those who are listening, especially if you are person to reside at number 7, you'll take the time now to understand you may have to, as you said before the commission, get permission from the toughest point to go and actually see the grave site. But I don't think that should be difficult to do as long as it's done in an
Oh,
orderly
you
manner.
just make the phone call and you have people in the area. I think that's what happened. But while I got the floor, there are a couple of things I wanted to mention that if anybody wanted to reach out to the Tuckerstown Historical Association, they can reach out to Kurt and we'll make sure that they get a message to them. They can do that through our website, uprootingracism.org, and they can send us a message, or they can call our office, and number I don't know offhand, I'm afraid. But if you know my number or you know my email, you can reach me. The other thing you mentioned too, but we didn't get a chance to go there, you raised this issue about a strong opposition. And as you get older, hopefully you get a little bit wiser. There are things that are said that are not necessarily unpacked. So you hear all the time that a good government needs a good opposition. And I think the essence of that statement is true. But what we might find is that the opposition may not necessarily be in the opposite benches. When you got about 6 members there, they may not be, but that doesn't mean you have a weak opposition. That means the people become part of the opposition. In fact, as the statement has been said before, the combined opposition, but that combined opposition involves the people, because the people become, well, first of all, any MP, and I'm sure yourself have said it to your constituents that, hold me accountable. If you think I'm not doing the right thing, let me know. Now, some people say that and don't take too kindly when it happens, but we are people that are not afraid to express our views, and I'm sure you've experienced that. The Bermudians are not, they will tell you when you're doing well, and they will tell you when you're not doing well.
Right.
I know that, and I never really refer to myself as a public figure, but I just can't get away from that. And people will stop me in the street. They will say, "You're doing a great job, keep up the good work." Or they will say, "Mr. Roddy, I will never work with you because you said such and such the other day, and I don't necessarily agree with that." And so they will tell you, and they will tell you why they don't feel that way. And if it's a conversation, then you can say, "Okay, I didn't think of it that way," or "I understand where you're coming from, and I still don't agree with you, but I understand where you're coming from." So these are the things that help you to be accountable,
Yes.
because people will tell you. So yes, one way is having a strong opposition, and again, it's a falsehood that says fewer numbers means a weak opposition, because the PLP of all parties know that you can have few numbers and still be a very, very strong opposition. It's your voice that carries. And I think the difference here, and I've said it elsewhere, is that the PLP had an ideology. There was something that they can all wrap their hands around.
Yeah.
There is something that they can fight for in the future that will be able to keep them going. The challenge with the OBA is that I don't necessarily see that. I don't understand what their ideology is, other than we're for business. What is it going to galvanize people to come behind them? What is it that they're fighting for?
Right.
I think that's the piece that's missing, and that's probably why people feel that it will be a weak opposition. It's not because of the numbers. It is what are you challenging? And of course. The PLP has had to go, and I think I mentioned this in the other interview, that Freddie Wade brought the PLP to the more center, left of center. And so some of the things that the PLP are challenging would have been, well, not challenging, but bringing about, are some of the things that maybe the OEA would have brought about. There's still the element of the grassroots part of it, and the things that are more people-oriented, but you've had to also look at business as well. So given that, where is the room for an OBA? It does, and you mentioned them earlier, an FDM, which seemed to be, in my mind, a little bit more righter than the right of the OBA, particularly with regard to some of the immigration policies, but they perhaps are just finding the way, and they'll have, and they can run that risk as a new party because they can test out different things. But what could very much happen is, they will do their homework, they will come out later on, and they would have some policies that may be more appealing to the voters, and in which case they would then be able to aim at replacing the OBA. They did that. This is action in some constituencies. So I think that's what could happen. So this whole notion that there's a weak opposition, I don't think so, because you've got now two opposition parties, and you've got the reading public, and certainly even sometimes the union. Everybody is trying to protect their turf.
Yes.
They're going to let the government know how they feel about things, and so this concern about the government can do whatever it wants, and I just don't.
No, right.
I don't buy into that, because I see the people doing what they did. I mean, even the last PLP term, you saw protests, and you saw marches, and you saw things like that. A Labour Party would hope they'll be able to sit down with a Labour movement and a Labour union and say, listen, let's go reach an agreement. But the fact of the matter remains, there may be times when you have to get to lock horns. But I think overall, as the FDM and as the OBA tend to work out where they ought to be, you'll see perhaps some strength in their ranks, and their voice will come to the fore. But like I said, I think they have to find what it is that they're fighting for in order for them to galvanize the people behind them, like the PLP did in the past.
That's actually an interesting conclusion, because we all know that the truth is that the PLP formed first as a political party,
Yes.
and the UBP formed in response
Yes.
to the PLP. And again, not so much we have an ideology, let's focus on this, as opposed to let's make sure the PLP does not win. And so that has taken its course, I suppose. And now we've moved from the UBP, down to the OBA. And as a teaser, not for today, but if anyone looks at those persons that have been involved in politics, there is actually a diminution, a reduction, a removal, a whatever you want to call that now, of the white businessmen out of politics. And I say that because you now, if you look at those who ran in the last election, compare them person to person with the PLP, you don't have that significant overweighting of business persons in the OBA team. And now in the PLP, I think clearly outweighs them in that context. In any objective assessment, I think that's what people will see. So I think that's going to be a teaser for another conversation in terms of how persons are moving out of politics.
I'll just touch upon that one bit. That's the way it's going to have to go. That's the way how the parties went in the Caribbean. The white businessmen sort of faded out of the political party up front to being sort of behind the scenes, and letting two predominantly black parties duke it out, if you will. And so many of us see that that's the way it's going to go. And of course, with the FDM, it probably it's at a stage where it's now beginning to evolve.
So again, for those who are listening to us and will see us and review these sessions, conversations in the future, think about that. To what degree will we mirror? And actually, I will also offer, to what degree have we seen that, or not seen it, but to what degree has it already taken place, whereby the financial funding has potentially moved from being exclusively for the OBA or the UBP and now to the other parties. And so we look forward to doing that. Again, Cordell, I want to thank you. Always good to hear from you and to ask questions and to share with you and to get information from you. I'll say again to the listening audience that you remain, in my mind, as one of the more objective persons. You're able to, you don't necessarily will always uphold what the PLP is trying to do, or the OBA, or now the FDM. You give honest and objective comments based upon your knowledge, your experience, and others that you talk to, and you're always involved in various forums. And so based on that, I believe for sure that you get access, or you're exposed to lots and lots of information. Believe it or not, we have come to the end of this session, and our next guest, we're going to confirm this, or we're going to start to advertise this, will be none other than the Honorable John Barrett. You know, and we all know he has an interesting story to tell, and so we'll allow him to talk about that next week. Today is his birthday, so we'll give a shout out to the Honorable John Barrett. Happy birthday to you as you celebrate today with your family. And again, our contact information is always going to be the same. Our dedicated phone number is 538-8683. If you forget that, it's 538-VOTE. You can always contact us certainly on Facebook, on Instagram. WhatsApp is a favorite of mine because you can send me messages and I can answer it when I have time to or when it's appropriate. So you can send me a message at 2 a.m. if you choose, and I'll answer at 7 or 9 a.m. depending upon timing or whatever. So again, thanks. I want to also again say thank you to my, what I call now my media team. They are always there behind the scenes. They don't want me to mention their names, but we can see them now and I'll give a nod. One of our team members is actually under the weather, so we'll give a shout out to Miss Angela. Hopefully you'll be coming back to us and be part of the team for next week. But again, to everyone, thank you. And little Miss Isis, I'm not sure where she is right now. I can't quite see these bright lights, but anyway, we have a very young person who's 12 years old that's working very hard behind the scenes and looking to see her involvement going forward. Not just her, but many other young people to go forward. There's Mr. Callan over there sitting up trying to pretend not to be interested, and Miss Santia is there behind. I can't quite see it, lights are so bright. But again, we'll give a shout out to my team and to those who are from your branch and otherwise listening, and to your beautiful wife who allows you to do something.
It is true. And she said she'd wait for me and have dinner when I get back. So I told her we'd be here before 8 o'clock. So she said that's okay.
So Leah's, if you listen to this now or look at it later on, we want to say thank you for not just to us, but certainly for what you do with Cordell and allowing him to be a godsend contributor. And so thanks. Until next week, all, when we'll interview Mr. John Barrett. Have a good evening.